We're going to record a basic macro that takes cells from one worksheet and deposits them at the bottom of this worksheet. Now, because this is an essential training course, we're only giving light coverage to macros. If you're interested in learning about macros in depth, check out some of the really great macro courses in the lynda.com library. But before we begin recording, there's some housekeeping that we need to do first. To record macros, we need to display the Developer tab on the ribbon bar. Now, on my computer here, you see there is no Developer tab. If you have the Developer tab on your computer, you don't have to go through this step. But I'm going to go here to the File tab to go into Backstage View. And down over here, let's click Options. And we have all the options categories here on the left. And let's click over here where it says Customize Ribbon. Now on the right, we have a list of all the tabs that are visible: Home, Insert, Page Layout, and so on. And over here is the Developer tab. So just click there to put a check, click OK. And now you can see there's the Developer tab up there on the ribbon bar. Click it, we have all the developer tools. And we also need to set security. So click down here on Macro Security. And you want to make sure that the second radio button is selected. It should be selected by default, but I want to make sure that you don't have the first button selected. And the idea is that there are nefarious characters writing macroviruses, and Excel tries to protect itself against them. If you have at least disable macros with notification, it means that when Excel sees that there's a workbook that contains macros, it'll at least notify you that, hey, there are macros here, do you want to enable them or not? If you have that first radio button selected, you won't even get a chance to run the macros. So let's click OK. And since we'll be taking data from another workbook, let's open that workbook now. So right now we have the recording macro.xlsx open. So either press Ctrl-O on your keyboard to open or go to the File tab and open. And in the Chapter 13 folder of your exercise files, open up the Northeast Data file. And you can see the structure is the same as the workbook that we were just looking at. We have order number, region, month, size, and quantity. Now to switch back and forth between one workbook and another, easiest way I think is to press Control F6. Hold down the Control key and press the F6 key on your keyboard. That works in just about every single Windows program under the sun, not just Excel. Now, for whatever reason you don't like Control F6, you could always go to the View tab and over here switch windows. Whichever you prefer is fine. And let's go back to the Developer tab. One last thing we need to decide when recording a macro is, are we recording with relative references or not with relative references? In other words, with absolute references. That's what this button lets us decide. Here's the idea. Right now I have cell B3 selected. When I record the macro and I hit the down arrow, let's say, no surprise, I go one cell down into cell B4. Well, when you're running the macro, what happens if you're starting on cell C3? When you hit the down arrow, what's going to happen? Are you going to go straight down to cell C4? Well, that's a relative reference. Or are you going to go literally to cell B4, which is an absolute reference, which is what you recorded? So that's what you have to decide is, will your navigation be exactly literally the cells that you're recording, or will they be relatively going up or going down, left or right? For the purposes of this macro that we're going to record, let's turn relative references on. Okay, now we're ready to record. So click the Record Macro button and the Record Macro dialog box comes up. So let's give it a name. I'll call this Get Data. Now, a macro cannot have spaces in the names. You can have either mixed case or you can use underscores. And let's supply a shortcut key. Because we're going to get data, I want to use a shortcut key of Control-Shift-G. So click in this box here and type Shift-G, like you're going to type a capital G. And you see it makes it Control-Shift-G. Now you might wonder, hey Bob, why make it Control-Shift-G? Why not just plain old Control-G? Why make this more difficult? And the answer is that in Excel, almost all of the Control this and Control that shortcuts are already used. Control-G is the command to go to a particular cell. And if we override that here, then Control-G will no longer be to go to a particular cell. But there are just about no Control-Shift anything in use in Excel. But I'll leave that up to you. That's personal preference. Now, we also need to decide where are we storing this macro. Over here it says where to store the macro in, and click that down arrow. And you have three choices: Personal Macro Workbook, New Workbook, or this workbook. Well, let me explain. The Personal Macro Workbook is a specific file that Excel keeps. And if you have macros in it, that is, if you record macros and put them in the Personal Macro Workbook, they will always be available when you start Excel, because what Excel will do is it will open the personal macro workbook when it starts up, but it'll open up hidden so it doesn't get in your way and there's no danger of you messing it up. Well, if you don't have a personal macro workbook, Excel will create it the very first time you select it. I think it's pretty cool. Now, if you choose to store your macro in a new workbook, Excel will literally create a brand new workbook and put your macro in there. You would use that option if you intend on distributing your macro to other people. Well, for the purposes of this exercise, let's keep the default of storing the macro in this workbook. And we'll do that because the macro that we're recording is really meant for this workbook, so there's no need to store it anywhere else. Now we could enter a description, and this is just kind of like a yellow sticky note that's attached to it. And we can type in something like gets data from other sheet and deposits and here. Okay, now when we click OK, then recording is live. So click OK. And how do you know recording is live? Up here you see the stop recording button. Now, real important, when you are done creating the macro, you need to click that stop recording button, because if you don't, everything you do, including opening and closing files and switching tabs and all that, will be recorded. And eventually the recording session will abort, Excel may crash, you won't be very happy. So just really need to remember to stop recording. Now, since we're going to be navigating through this worksheet, I think it's a lot easier and a lot more accurate if we use some handy shortcuts, and I'll give you everything you need to know. In general, when I do something like that, I find it's always best to start in the upper left corner in cell A1, so press Control Home. Now, the advantage of that is when you play back the macro, it doesn't matter which cell you have selected. You could be selected in cell Q4300, and you'll immediately go back to cell A1 so you can start selecting the cells that you want. Now, the data that we bring in, we want that to start in cell A13. Well, right now we want it to start in cell A13 because that's the next row, but once we have data from the workbook that we're bringing in, the next time we bring in data, we want it to start at the first blank row there. So it's not always literally A13. So how do we get there? Well, press Control down arrow. The first time you press Control down arrow, it goes to the starting line there. Press Control down arrow again. You see it goes to the end of that section. So you just pressed Control down arrow twice. Now just press the down arrow by itself. So you are absolutely 100% guaranteed that your cursor is now in the first blank available row. Now we already opened up that other workbook, so let's switch there. Now I'm going to press Control F6. If you prefer, you could go to the View tab and use the Switch Windows command. So I'll press Control F6. Remember, this is being recorded by the macro. And like we did before, press Control Home, so it doesn't matter what cell is selected in this workbook when you open it. And we'll do kind of the same thing. Press Control down arrow. Once that gets to the column header, well, we don't want to select the column headers, so just hit the down arrow. All right, so we pressed Control Home, we then pressed Control down arrow, then we pressed the down arrow by itself. Now, we want to get to the last used row. Now, in this case, it's row 12. In another workbook, it might be a different row. So we want to make sure that the macro gets exactly the data and doesn't leave out any data and doesn't get any blank rows. So that's why clicking with the mouse really isn't going to work. So press Control Shift down arrow. So that selects to the end of this row. Now we need to leave these cells selected and also select to the right. So press Control Shift right arrow. So you are now guaranteed to select all of the data here. Now we need to copy to the clipboard. I'll press Control C to copy. If you prefer, you could go to the Home tab and click the copy button. Either way will work. Okay, so we have this copied to the clipboard. We see the marching ants. Now let's switch back. Again, I'll press Control F6, or if you want, you could go to the View tab and switch windows. It's your choice. Now our cursor is in the right spot, so all we have to do is paste. So I'll press Control V to paste. If you prefer, you could go to the Home tab and click Paste. There we go. Now we want to clear off the clipboard, so press the Escape key. And let's deselect all of these cells. So just press the Home key. It doesn't really matter which cell you have selected. All right, now we're ready to stop recording. So go to the Developer tab if you're not already there, and click Stop Recording. Okay, great. Well, we recorded the macro. How do we know it works? Well, let's bring in data from another region. So right now we have the Central region, we have the Northeast region. I'm just going to press Control F6. Here's the Northeast data. Let's just close this file. And let's go open another one. So you could press Control O or go to the File tab and open. So we have Central, we have Northeast. Let's open up Southeast. Double click it. You can click anywhere, it doesn't matter. Maybe go back here to the recording macro. Let's run the macro. Press Control Shift G and boom, there it is. So we have Central, Northeast, Southeast. Let's try it again. Just press Control F6 and let's close the Southeast data because we already have the data. And let's open. Again, press Control O or go to the File menu and open. And let's open up the West data. Okay, so it doesn't matter what cell you have selected. Control F6, let's switch back here. And again, press Control Shift G. And boom, there's your West data. And notice there's different numbers of rows for each region. We have Central is a little, Northeast is more. We have a lot more West data than the others. So if you were to try selecting cells by clicking with your mouse, you really wouldn't know which cell to select or how many cells to select. But by using those keyboard shortcuts, there's absolutely no chance for error, as long as you do it right. Now, one more thing. If we want to save this file with the macro in it, we can't just save with the .xls extension. We have to save this workbook in a macro-enabled format. So you could either press F12 to save as, or go to the File tab and Save As. And we could keep the name, but for the file type, click that drop-down. And up here, let's choose Excel Macro-Enabled Workbook. See, it's a .xlsm, and click Save. Now, just one more thing. This isn't some exercise I simply dreamed up for this course. This is only a slightly simplified version of a real set of macros I once created for a client that used it every single day. What would happen is in the mornings, they would import new data from an order system using techniques that we covered in the movie on importing and exporting, and they would bring those data into a growing worksheet just like we had here. So if you completed this exercise, give yourself some congratulations.